Princess of Wales pledged herself to serve her country and her people, and to maintain the precious principles of constitutional government which lie at the heart of our nation.
Britain expected just another routine royal statement. Instead, King Charles delivered a sudden announcement that instantly redrew the entire future of the monarchy. In front of the flashing cameras, whispering courtiers, and a stunned nation, the king placed Catherine at the centre of the crown's survival plan. William stood motionless beside her. Camilla's expression visibly tightened, and as Catherine listened to this heavy new authority being placed directly into her hands, she understood that her life had just crossed a sharp line from which there could be no return. Before we dive deeper into what this dramatic shift actually means for the royal family, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our updates. Hours earlier, Catherine walked into Buckingham Palace beside William and sensed a quiet danger beneath the silence. Senior royals had already been summoned, but the chairs stood in strict order, and Princess Anne watched Charles instead of the cameras. The monarch arrived carrying a leather folder, brushed aside remarks from his secretary, and sat down without a single smile. Camilla did not move a muscle. She knew whatever rested inside that leather folder had not been drafted for mere ceremony. Charles slowly opened the document and signed the Royal Continuity Declaration, a sudden critical order setting out who would guide royal work during the monarchy's next difficult chapter. He officially named Catherine the first Crown Steward, meaning she would coordinate all senior engagements, key charitable priorities, public representation, and the critical preparations for William's future reign. The king declared she would no longer just stand beside the future king, she would help direct the entire institution immediately. Catherine quietly lowered her eyes. Her fingers tightened against the cold table as a wave of pride collided with fear, and William reached toward her hand without saying a word. He felt relief that his wife's service had finally been recognized, yet feared the crown was placing another heavy burden upon her. Princess Anne closely studied her brother's face. Camilla remained dead silent, but the Queen Consort's tense posture still exposed how sharply power had shifted. This decision carried a dark secret. Palace advisors had prepared a much safer version, offering Catherine a grand title but very little real control. Just moments before entering, Charles crossed out those cautious limits with his own pen and restored direct authority. He had not created a mere decoration, he had built real power. William noticed a second hidden page sealed beneath the declaration. Charles kept one hand flat over it as the cameras finally withdrew, revealing only enough to show that strict conditions remained. Those terms explained exactly why the transfer could not wait, and why Catherine had been chosen above every other senior royal in the family. As the doors closed, the king quietly asked her and William to stay behind. Camilla glanced back before leaving, knowing the announcement had just opened a tense private reckoning. The entire nation had heard what Catherine was now becoming, but behind the heavy closed doors of Buckingham Palace, the people closest to her were about to discover exactly what her swift rise would cost them all. While the announcement carried Catherine's name, its massive consequences reached into every single corner of the royal family. For William, it was a massive declaration of trust in the woman who had carried his heavy future beside him for years. As for Charles, it was an urgent attempt to protect the crown before time could make that decision for him. For Camilla, however, the new title raised a much colder question. Had the king just elevated Catherine, or had he quietly begun replacing the entire world built around his own queen? Catherine felt the crushing weight of the moment before anyone even explained it. For years, she had balanced motherhood, marriage, public duty, and the constant knowledge that one day she might stand beside William as queen. Now this crown steward role completely removed the comfortable safety of waiting. It was a newly created position, giving her direct authority over all royal work and future planning, which meant every single decision could deeply affect senior family members, national charities, and the path toward the next reign. Yet her deepest fear was not the whispering palace. It was George, Charlotte, and Louis. She had spent years fiercely protecting them from the immense pressure surrounding their names, and now she was being asked to strengthen the very institution capable of consuming their childhood. William quietly closed the sitting room door and turned slowly toward his wife. He asked whether she truly deeply wanted this. Catherine watched him carefully, knowing the prince was not questioning her inner strength. He was simply remembering the long evenings when she returned completely exhausted and still sat with the children, fiercely refusing to let duty steal the last part of their day. She placed her hand gently over his and said wanting this role was no longer the only question. If fear decided the future, the entire monarchy would remain trapped inside the exact same weaknesses Charles was now trying to repair. William began to object, but she held his gaze firmly until he finally fell silent. Camilla returned to her private rooms and removed a heavy bracelet slowly before sitting down alone. She was not merely threatened by Catherine's immense popularity. The Queen Consort fully understood that authority was shifting rapidly toward the next generation, while she and the King still occupied the center. Charles called it continuity. To her, it felt like a harsh early verdict on the very reign they had fought so hard to build. She wondered whether the British public would now see Catherine as the true female power within the monarchy, leaving Camilla present but increasingly painfully irrelevant. Princess Anne had fully expected this storm. In a documented private conversation, quietly preserved by a senior royal secretary, she told Edward that Charles had consulted her several weeks earlier. Anne supported genuine authority for Catherine, but warned that a mere ceremonial title would only create deep resentment. Edward listened quietly as his sister explained that the monarch had completely rejected half measures because the palace no longer had time for empty appearances without action. Charles's sealed page carried the single most dangerous condition of all. It stated that Catherine's authority could expand independently if William became unable or unwilling to perform certain duties. That single clause protected the crown, but it also meant a husband and wife might eventually find themselves opposing each other over a royal decision. Just before Catherine walked out, the king looked at her, stating this declaration was not written for some vague, distant crisis. An incident had already occurred deep inside the palace walls, and it convinced him that waiting any longer was dangerous. Catherine held the future of the monarchy in a sealed document, yet the real spark for Charles's urgent move remained buried in a dark moment. The palace tried hard to forget. This royal continuity declaration did not actually start at some quiet desk inside a committee room or during legal discussions. Instead, it began during a massive ceremony watched by millions, where a brief, awkward hesitation exposed a vulnerability no palace statement could hide. Most viewers only saw Catherine stepping forward calmly to restore order. Charles saw something much more unsettling. In those brief seconds, the king realized the institution was already relying heavily on her, even though nobody had given her the legal authority to protect it. Months of quiet strain had already deeply eroded the peace of the royal household. Cancelled events clashed with messy, conflicting orders, leaving rival palace teams to fight each other rather than work together. Catherine kept stepping into the crossfire, calming furious aides and saving schedules just before they collapsed. Yet she possessed zero formal power. Every temporary fix relied entirely on goodwill, meaning a single stubborn refusal or bruised ego could paralyze the entire royal system. Charles noticed the silent pattern before anyone dared name it. Junior staff looked right to Catherine whenever confusion filled a room, and major charities constantly begged for her direct help. She rarely issued flat demands. Instead, she simply listened until tempers cooled, then gently guided them toward a shared agreement. At one private meeting, the king gave a direct order and noticed an aide glance at her before obeying. His face instantly hardened. He dismissed the room sharply. He was thankful for Catherine's competence, yet deeply troubled that his own rule apparently required her quiet nod. Catherine carried a very different fear home to William. She told the prince she felt uneasy being the quick fix for every palace crisis. Every extra task dragged her further away from George, Charlotte, and Louis. At the same time, each public victory made it look like she wanted to push Charles and Camilla aside. William promised to protect her. He truly believed he could shield his wife. But neither of them realized how fast a single public event would shatter that promise. The Commonwealth Renewal Service became their point of no return. This massive ceremony was designed to refresh the Crown's public bond with wealth nations through a major live address and sacred promises. Charles began the main reading, then suddenly stopped. Two conflicting briefing cards sat right in front of him, pointing to completely different paragraphs. A heavy silence filled the ancient abbey. William started moving forward to support his father, but Catherine reacted much faster. She stood up without any warning, walked straight to the lectern, and silently pointed to the correct words. Charles found his spot and went on. The future king stood closely beside his father until the older man's voice steadied. The whole mistake lasted under 60 seconds. Yet every royal sitting nearby understood the grim truth. Without her help, simple confusion would have become public humiliation. Charles summoned Catherine to a private meeting that same evening. In official notes written down by his personal secretary, the king freely confessed that she saved both his personal dignity and the reputation of the throne. She answered that she acted as a daughter-in-law, not a future queen. He countered that the royal family could not keep surviving on these desperate unofficial rescues. Charles started writing his formal declaration early the next morning. Camilla heard of his decision through a recorded briefing, immediately demanding a private meeting. She warned him that handing Catherine actual legal authority might shield the crown, but it would easily tear the fragile family apart. The public disaster convinced Charles that Catherine required real standing, but Camilla intended to make him face exactly what that power would steal from everyone else. No cameras were allowed inside the king's private library. No assistants taking notes, and zero polished scripts to soften the harsh truth of what followed. Camilla walked in confident she could talk Charles into stalling, while Catherine arrived merely expecting a light talk about future duties. Instead, the three suddenly had to face decades of personal sacrifice, hidden insecurity, and quiet rivalry. And then, Camilla dropped the single question that changed everything. Was Catherine being groomed to assist the Queen, or simply to make her completely obsolete? Charles ordered the final aide out and locked the door. He threw the half-written royal continuity document on the table, the historic decree meant to dictate exactly how power and duties would shift in the next era. William waited outside on the king's direct orders. The future king hated leaving his wife unprotected, but Charles insisted that Catherine must speak for herself, and Camilla had to face her without any allies watching. The king looked at both women and muttered that empty, polite talk could never decide the future. Camilla leaned forward, speaking first. She argued that having two separate centers of female power would split the household before the new system even started. Major charities might completely bypass the Queen Consort, taking their appeals straight to Catherine. Royal staff would probably delay major decisions, waiting to see which woman held the real power. Worse still, foreign hosts might treat the younger royal as the monarchy's true leading lady, while Charles's own reign was just beginning. Her anxiety was deeply personal, but it was far from empty. This fractured authority risked turning their private rivalry into public chaos. Catherine stayed quiet, listening patiently until Camilla demanded to know if she honestly felt ready to judge senior family members. That question cut much deeper than any outright accusation. She paused, then quietly replied that she had no desire to control anyone. But if walking away from this duty put the crown at greater risk, she refused to hide behind modesty. Camilla snapped back that patience would prove her loyalty, but Catherine pushed her chair away, arguing that loyalty couldn't mean watching problems grow worse just to save face. Though her voice stayed calm and steady, Charles could hear years of buried pain and frustration bleeding through every single word. The king opened another thick folder filled with frozen decisions and conflicting household orders. Alongside reports of public events Catherine had quietly saved, he told Camilla this new role was not some prize for popularity. It was protection for crucial work she was already doing without any official support, safety nets, or accountability. Camilla turned on her husband, forcing the hard choice right into the open. Would he sign if it permanently damaged their marriage and weakened her own standing? Charles took off his reading glasses and placed them right next to the file. His reply was slow. His first duty lay with the crown. She looked away, and that heavy silence cut deeper than any words ever could. Catherine broke the quiet. She would take the job only if her power was real, fully transparent, and never weaponized to humiliate anyone else in the family. Charles nodded. But outside that closed room, secret drafts were already passing through palace halls, and someone had begun carving the power right out of her new role before she could even step into it. Charles had survived the tense standoff, and Catherine had finally accepted this heavy new burden. Yet right outside the library doors, an even quieter war was starting over. Who would actually control the power she had just been promised? Royal decrees might be read by kings, but the real power is carved out in back rooms by people whose names never hit the front page. Even as Charles prepared to sign the official declaration, rival drafts were slipping through the palace. One version handed Catherine absolute authority. Another watered her position down to empty ceremonial words. By sunrise, entire paragraphs had simply vanished. This wasn't an open mutiny against the king. It was something much more clever, letting Charles announce a major historic change, while quietly ensuring that absolutely nothing would change at all. Palace officials moved fast after that dramatic showdown. Secretaries, lawyers, PR teams, and senior chiefs combed through every single line, knowing that just one misplaced word could shift the balance of power forever. The Crown Steward was the prestigious new title created to coordinate senior royal duties. But that fancy title was useless unless Catherine controlled the money, the schedules, and the major crisis decisions. Sure, some aides welcomed a clear chain of command. Others deeply feared she would expose the bitter rivalry between Charles's household and William's team. Charles read the new draft alone before dawn. His eyes stopped right where the words "final coordinating authority" had been erased. Without those key words, Catherine could offer gentle advice, but had no real power to enforce a single decision. The king circled the blank space, pressing his pen so hard he tore the page before furiously summoning Anne. His anger was fueled by deep humiliation. This quiet rebellion hadn't come from some rival faction. It grew inside the very institution that claimed to obey him. William reacted with far less restraint. He warned Catherine that accepting a weakened role would leave her blamed for failures she had no power to prevent. The prince wanted to confront every courtier involved, but his wife stopped him. She warned him that loud protests from the future king would let enemies paint the entire declaration as a hostile takeover designed by the couple. Catherine saw the trap. If he fought too hard for her, his loyalty would be twisted and used against her. Anne traced the changes by digging through paper trails, old draft records, and private messages. She uncovered a group of old-school courtiers who believed all real power must stay centered around the reigning king and queen. Now, Camilla hadn't actually ordered these changes, but a loyal aide from her household had pushed for them, convinced that keeping Catherine weak safeguarded the queen consort's standing. Anne brought these findings straight to her brother, warning him that staying quiet looked like surrender. Charles personally restored the missing clause. He then added a strict safeguard requiring written justifications whenever someone dared to challenge Catherine's decisions. Anne watched him initial the new clause, making quiet backroom interference almost impossible. The king had finally drawn a hard line that even his own household couldn't cross. The first real test hit before the ink was dry. 2 rival offices issued conflicting orders for an overseas tour, and both expected Charles to settle the war. He refused flat out. The king slid the heavy file across to Catherine and said the Crown Steward had to make the call. One option would deeply anger Camilla. The other would surely break William's trust. Catherine had fought hard for this authority in principle. Now her very first real decision would prove if she could handle such power when loyalty, family, and duty pulled in completely opposite directions. The ink on the declaration was barely dry when she faced the choice that turns empty titles into heavy consequences. A massive Commonwealth tour had been promised to two separate senior royals, and neither side was willing to step back. One itinerary carried Camilla's personal stamp of approval. The other had been built entirely around William. Every single advisor expected Catherine to delay, find a soft compromise, or push the mess back to Charles. Instead, she shut the folder, looked right across the table, and issued her first real command. Chaos had already rippled deep through two separate households. Camilla had spent weeks getting ready to lead the official Commonwealth Women's Partnership Tour, a fictional overseas initiative designed specifically to support women-led educational and health projects across the member states. William's office, however, had received separate written instructions, placing both him and Catherine at that exact same event. Pulling the plug on either plan would waste months of intense preparation, deeply embarrass foreign hosts, and expose a bitter feud at the very top of the institution. Charles absolutely refused to bail them out. He flatly told both camps that this new setup had to work in the real world, not just look good on paper. Nervous courtiers gathered around the large table as Catherine quietly examined the dates, schedules, and official sign-off records. They watched closely for any sign of hesitation. Would she shield her husband, yield to the Queen Consort, or dodge the decision by running back to the King? Catherine chose hard duty over personal comfort. She ruled that Camilla must lead the tour because her official commitment had been logged first, while William would instead head a massive domestic project that desperately needed some high-profile royal backing. The prince's jaw clenched tight. He accepted her ruling in front of the room, but his heavy silence screamed disappointment. Behind closed doors, he told his wife that she had basically rewarded his father's staff for making such a mess. She quietly replied that fairness couldn't change just because of who made the slip-up. Meanwhile, Camilla got the update while getting ready for another event. She paused, set down her lipstick, and waited for a rush of relief, but absolutely none came. Catherine had not bowed down to her. She had simply weighed the hard evidence and protected the Queen's prior calendar date. The ruling stripped away the excuses, exposing Camilla's anxiety as pure rivalry instead of noble principle, and she knew that lashing out at the younger woman now would only make her look incredibly small compared to the rival she wanted to control. Then Catherine dug out the real betrayal. A paper trail of emails and calendar logs proved a senior staffer had deliberately let both schedules clash, hoping the inevitable wreck would completely destroy her new authority. She immediately stripped the coordinator of all succession planning duties while a full inquiry took place. This critical planning meant managing the highly sensitive transitions for future reigns and shifts in crown power. The room went dead silent. On day one, she had wielded serious firing power. Within hours, King Charles received a desperate private plea from the ousted official. He skimmed it once, folded the paper, and sent it back, unsigned. That cold rejection sent an incredibly clear, brutal message. Catherine's word could not be bypassed, no matter how uncomfortable her hard choices made the household. Late that night, she found William sitting alone, with candid family photos of George, Charlotte, and Louis scattered all over his desk. He admitted he supported her new power, but feared the institution was turning them into cold bureaucrats instead of letting them just be husband and wife. Her swift order proved she could rule the palace with an iron hand, but that victory meant absolutely nothing if this power started cracking the one marriage her future relied on. For the very first time since the big announcement, there were no whispering staff, heavy folders, or rigid royal duties standing between them. She slipped in well past midnight. His tie was loose, and those polished pre-written speeches lay abandoned across his dark desk. He wasn't furious because she had ruled against him. He was simply terrified watching the crown slowly claim another piece of the woman he loved. As she shut the heavy door behind her, William did not speak to her like a future king. He spoke as a fragile husband, terrified of losing his soulmate to their crushing future. Catherine stood in silence as that heavy truth settled over the room. Her grueling new obligations were bleeding deep into the night, just as his own royal workload started to double. Their quiet talks now revolved around dry itineraries, staff wars, and state obligations, rather than their kids, their deep anxieties, or just each other. They both saw the cliff. Duty had wrecked generations of royal marriages before them, slowly suffocating the private, fragile intimacy that could have saved them. William clearly remembered that sacred promise she had made so many years ago. Catherine had agreed to marry into this life only if they promised to protect one safe, private space where the firm could never touch them. The prince now deeply feared this new crown steward role was directly threatening that very promise. It handed her independent power to direct senior royal diaries, but it also let the firm invade her life at any hour. He knew exactly why Charles needed her. Looking up, William finally spoke the raw truth he had been hiding. Hostile headlines, public doubt, constant criticism, he could handle all that. What he could not stand was the dread that Catherine might look at him one day and see just another mess she had to manage. His voice cracked, admitting her quiet strength made everyone blindly forget that she had actual human limits. The future king worried the crown would take and take until she simply forgot how to stop. Catherine stepped closer flatly, refusing to play the role of a silent martyr. She told him plainly she had not been dragged helplessly toward the throne. Her path meant choosing William, their kids, and the heavy future ahead of them. Protecting her could never mean choosing for her or forcing her to play small just to keep their marriage safe. He listened, seeing she was not throwing away his devotion. Instead, she demanded that his love respect her agency. Then, she revealed the strict condition she set before agreeing. Through a written clause witnessed by Charles, she locked in private family times when absolutely no palace could summon her, barring a major national emergency. She also got to step back without giving up her title. William stared at his wife, realizing she had predicted this exact trap long before he found the strength to voice it. He pulled the declaration from his desk drawer and signed a private pledge, a written vow backing her independent royal power. A vow to disagree behind closed doors, but fiercely defend her office in public. Catherine held him tight as the dread melted into a real partnership. Charles rang early the next morning, wanting both of them standing right beside him for the public announcement. But when the heavy gates swung open, the crowd outside was massive, roaring, and far more emotional than anyone ever expected. Behind closed doors, the royal couple had chosen solidarity over fear. Beyond the castle walls, the public debated whether her new rise meant genuine hope, pure ambition, or the start of a palace revolution. Come morning, Catherine's fate was no longer just a family secret. It was splashed across front pages, argued over on morning television, and discussed by onlookers at the gates. Many saw a modern monarchy honouring its best asset. Others saw a quiet power grab masked in ceremonial legal speak. Suddenly a single photo captured the entire mood. Catherine pulled up with William as the massive crowd chanted her name. Charles stood just a few steps back, quietly listening to the future take over. The public devoured the announcement instantly. Tabloids ran huge graphic layouts explaining this new crown steward position, a symbolic title giving Catherine the power to manage household duties and run plans for the next king. News channels cut into live broadcasts, while royal experts argued if Charles had just built the most dominant palace role in 100 years. Fans cheered her dedication finally being rewarded. Detractors slammed it as succession based purely on hype, even though William was still the true heir and the line was untouched. Catherine heard the harshest criticism on her drive to Buckingham Palace. A caller on the radio accused her of subtly hoarding influence behind a sweet smile. She reached to turn it down, but William stayed her hand. True leadership means listening even when people get hostile. Leaving the radio on, she swallowed every painful jab, knowing that blocking them out made her title feel empty. Charles suffered a different kind of bruise behind palace walls. Watching the news, he heard analysts crown Catherine the real focal point of the firm, For a split second, the monarch looked swallowed up by the future he unleashed. Princess Anne noticed. She reminded her brother that paving the way for the next crown did not mean giving up his own. He nodded slowly, knowing history never asks before leaving you behind. Outside the palace, one image said it all. A street vendor held up a front page, shouting the bold headline, "Charles hands Catherine the future." Hundreds packed the metal barriers. When Catherine stepped from the car with William, the massive crowd went dead silent. Then applause erupted, swelling into a loud, rhythmic chant, "Catherine, Catherine!" But she did not walk inside. Instead, she turned back and waited patiently for the king. Charles walked out first, but refused to stand alone at the centre. The king waved Catherine to his right and William to his left, proving to the world she had his complete backing. Next came Camilla. Most people assumed the queen consort would stay hidden inside, but she stepped out willingly. Her arrival crushed any rumours of a boycott, offering something far harder than joy, quiet, reluctant acceptance. Catherine felt them gather close, but the drama was not over yet. Once the crowd dispersed, Charles asked her back into the private study, where this whole pact had started. His last words would not be about calendars, ranks, or power. They would be about the person he knew she had to become. The public had spoken, and the royals had put up a totally united front. Yet her transition would not be fully complete until the king explained exactly what he believed she was destined to become. When she walked back into his private study for the final time, that paper was no longer resting between them. Charles personally locked the document away in the deep royal archives, sealing it forever into the monarchy's permanent record. What he actually needed to tell her required no official signatures. Adoring crowds were not the reason he chose Catherine, nor was her obedience. He chose her because when the crown itself wavered, she repeatedly put duty ahead of raw fear and kept the humanity that this cold palace so often crushes. Charles gestured for her to sit down, his voice completely stripped of that cold royal command. This new crown steward role was never meant to build a rival throne or diminish Camilla. It existed to stop the palace from panicking during a crisis, giving Catherine clear authority over future planning. The king told her she would no longer save this family from the shadows. She would prepare their future in the open, fully protected. This brutal journey had changed absolutely everyone. Charles had met weakness with decisive action. Catherine had survived the bitter family war, and William chose partnership. Camilla stepped out publicly to quiet the threat of open war, while the king's absolute refusal to back down turned a controversial declaration into accepted law. But one deep wound still bled. Charles looked down, offering a rare apology. He admitted they had used her quiet, flawless composure as an excuse to demand even more from her. He had loaded another burden on her without asking what duty already cost her. Swallowing back her tears, she quietly answered that duty becomes toxic when you are expected to pretend you feel absolutely nothing. The king nodded slowly. He knew her raw honesty was not weakness. In fact, it was why he trusted her. Camilla was waiting in the corridor. When Catherine walked out, the queen admitted in a private moment that she only fought the role because she dreaded becoming completely invisible. The younger woman offered no easy, comforting promises about the future. She simply said power would never become revenge. Camilla accepted that, and their bitter rivalry cooled into guarded respect. Catherine entered the final meeting with William right beside her. She announced her top priority was a single, highly coordinated household where private mental health and welfare mattered just as much as cold public duty. Silent suffering would no longer define her survival. She would lead on her own healthy, sustainable terms. William stood by her as an equal partner. Princess Anne pledged her loyalty instantly. Charles ordered the entire staff to respect this new power. Camilla officially agreed. The bitter war that had threatened to tear them apart was finally over. This did not make Catherine queen before her time. Instead, it proved that the monarchy's survival already rested on her strength, judgment, and deep grace. She was done waiting in the shadows as a quiet, harmless symbol of the crown. She would lead them forward, as the woman the palace had finally learned to trust. With the king's signature secured and William's absolute backing, Camilla's quiet rebellion was silenced and Catherine's path was clear. The monarchy stepped into its new era, completely united and transformed forever. They were no longer afraid of what came next. If you want more of these royal insider stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button.